Os fones de ouvido, quem quiser para a tradução, já pode pegar aqui atrás, né? Já tá. Beleza. Quem quiser a tradução da palestra do Chris, pode pegar. Espera. Bom, enquanto isso, vou fazer a introdução. Hoje, o nosso palestrante inaugural é o professor Christopher que eu também conheço já de longa data. Aliás, eu fui a segunda postdoc do Chris, né? I was your second postdoc, wasn't I? I think I was postdoc number 2. Há muito tempo lá na Universidade de Tübingen, onde ele é professor de geoarqueologia desde 2010. E ele continua lá, ele também está associado ao Centro Senckenberg de Evolução Humana, também ao Centro de Estudos do Comportamento Sapiens, na Universidade da Noruega. E o Chris, bom, ele conseguiu criar um polo de geoarqueologia lá em Tübingen, ele tem um grupo de trabalho em geoarqueologia, com laboratórios que fazem microanálise super avançadas, ele junto com a Susan Menzer também, que lideram essa área, e, bom, comigo é uma colaboração já de longa data, a gente tem troca de estudantes, as minhas estudantes têm ido lá para a Alemanha várias vezes fazer estágios, o Chris sempre recebe super bem, então a gente mantém essa colaboração. E, em termos de pesquisa, o que o Chris tem feito ao longo da sua carreira, ele trabalha em vários contextos, mas o foco é o estudo do Paleolítico Médio, principalmente na costa africana, também em contextos interioranos da África do Sul, e também os sítios do Paleolítico Médio da região próxima a Tübingen, né, do Vale dos Rios Lone e Ar, na Europa, né, na Alemanha. Ele tem trabalhado muito também com a pesquisa vinculada a estruturas de combustão, como a gente identifica, como a gente estuda elas, se são ou não são. Vocês veem que a queima é um tema que no Paleolítico importa muito, e o Chris tem sido um dos pioneiros também nessa área de trabalho. O Chris tem vários projetos também já com financiamento do que seria a agência de pesquisa alemã para desenvolver esses trabalhos na África do Sul e também na Alemanha, na região que ele trabalha, mas ele também supervisiona muitos estudantes fazendo principalmente micromorfologia em várias áreas do mundo, né? E, bom, para mim foi uma maravilha poder ter passado esses 2 anos lá no grupo do Chris em Tübingen, e a gente mantém essas colaborações até hoje. Queria agradecer muito ele também por ter vindo aqui. Eu sei que, como todos os nossos convidados, pessoas muito ocupadas e reservaram essa semana para vir. So, Chris, thank you very much for coming over here. I was just telling everybody, I know you're a very busy guy, just like all of our guests. So it's an honor to have you here for a week, having to know Sao Paulo, know our university campus, and get a bit of the experience of the geoarchaeology that we do in South America. So thank you very much for that. And please feel free to go on with your talk. You can do this one.
Okay. Okay, good. Is there a pointer?
Ponteiro maior.
Okay.
Just try to always keep the microphone in, because for the live transmission, the sound will only get caught here.
Okay. Okay, so this works. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, first of all, Jimena, thank you so much for bringing me here. It's after all these years, it's really nice to finally come to Brazil and see the amazing facilities and the amazing group that you've been able to build up here, and also to see Kelly and Jordana and Mayara here in their own environment after having spent time in Tübingen as well. So today I'd like to talk about the work that we've been doing for over a decade now in South Africa. Before I begin, usually, whoops. Okay. 1 second. That works. There we go. Okay, great. Yep. So normally you put your acknowledgements at the end, but I wanted to do acknowledgements at the beginning because, as we've heard from a lot of other people, these projects and keynote talks are not done by single people, right? And this is very true of the work that I'll be presenting today. And in particular, this is a work that I've been collaborating on with Susan Menser for a very long time. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it here to Brazil, but I'm sure we'll be both of us here again sometime in the future. But also, a lot of the work, particularly at Blombos, is work that Magnus Holland did as part of his PhD and postdoc working with me. And a lot of the work at Sibutu and also Deep Kloof was done together with Paul Goldberg, who in a way was really an inspiration for a lot of the type of work that we've been doing here. And as you'll see, we've been working at a lot of different sites in South Africa over the years. And there are many archaeological teams that we've been collaborating with and very important people that have been influential in this work, and just wanted to acknowledge this. My name's on the title, but it's really a collaborative work. So what I'd like to cover today, first of all, is, well, what is the Middle Stone Age? I realize we're here in a completely different, we're in the Southern Hemisphere, but also in the Western Hemisphere. And we've been talking a lot about the Paleolithic, but what we've heard so far from Carolina and Marijke is about the European Paleolithic. But the Stone Age, as we call it in Africa, is also kind of the Paleolithic, but the Paleolithic of Africa. So I'd like to discuss why this is so important, but also why the MSA of South Africa has kind of become a laboratory for the development of different methods and also kind of theories within geoarchaeology. In particular, I'd like to focus on the ideas of microcontextual analysis and also microfacies analysis, which have really, I think, been kind of developed strongly within this context. Then I'll give a couple of case studies of our work. I'd like to look at how we use microcontextual analysis to understand chemical diagenesis acting at these sites, looking at a case study from the site of Eland's Bay Cave. And then I would like to focus in on kind of microfacies analysis and how we're using that to understand anthropogenic deposits, looking at the sites of Sibutu, Deep Kloof, and then also finishing with Blombos. So the Middle Stone Age of Southern Africa is roughly contemporaneous to the Middle Paleolithic of Europe. There are debates about the beginning and the end, but roughly 300,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago is the time period that we're talking about. This is a very large time period. When archaeologists are talking about the Middle Stone Age, and particularly the sites that I'll be talking about, we're focusing on more of the later part of this time period. And a lot of this discussion focuses on two distinct techno-complexes terms that you'll hear me use, the so-called still bay, which is associated with these bifacial points, dates roughly, and this is very controversial, but dates roughly around 70,000 years ago, and then the Howson's port, which is associated with these backed blades and segmented tools, post-dates the still bay around 65 to 60,000 years ago. Why this time period has really attracted a lot of archaeological research over the past decade or two is because it's associated with types of artifacts that we generally tend to associate with later time periods. For example, we find some of the earliest evidence in the Middle Stone Age of Southern Africa for perforated shell beads, so personal adornment. The earliest evidence for engravings here on engraved ostrich eggshells. Here also engravings on ochre. So we see some of the earliest evidence for symbolic artifacts. At the same time, we also see some of the earliest appearances of technologies that are found much later in places like Europe. So for example, the use of bone for tools, bow and arrows are appearing at this time. Different hafting recipes have been identified, heat treatment of lithics, etc. So overall, the archaeological assemblage that we find at this time period tends to be what we would associate more with what we would call modern humans. Okay, these are anatomically modern humans. They're Homo sapiens, right? At this time period, we have Homo sapiens in Africa. In Europe, we have Neanderthals. Europe, we have Denisovans. Okay, but here with Homo sapiens, this is the first time that they're starting to make material culture that resembles material culture that we would associate with ourselves today. And so this means that the Middle Stone Age is a place where we can really begin to investigate the origins of this type of behavior. Now, there are reasons that geoarchaeologists are very excited about the Middle Stone Age, and that's because many of these sites are associated with sandstone rock shelters, and the deposits that we find within them are really quite distinct. Here we see, for example, Classy's River, here the site of Sibutu, and you see that many of them are defined by these very finely laminated, organic-rich deposits of charcoal and ash. And this is true for many of these important sites. Here, for example, we see the site of Blombos Cave with these finely laminated deposits. Here, the site of Deep Kloof. Here, Classy's River, Klipdrift Shelter, Rose Cottage Cave, Bushman Rock Shelter. We saw Blombos already, but Sibutu here. In addition, not only are these sites kind of beautiful in terms of their laminations and lenses, but there's also an ugly side to it as well, as you can see here, with all of these really terrifying looking nodules that are growing within it, okay? So these are incredibly complex deposits that have not only a complex depositional history, but also a complex post-depositional history. And this really requires kind of an in-depth geoarchaeological investigation. So I began working in South Africa in 2008, starting at the site of Sibutu and then Deep Kloof. And then over the years, myself and Susan Menser have been able to expand our work, collecting samples and working on a number of sites across South Africa dating to the Middle Stone Age. In this talk, I want to focus on 4 of these sites that we'll use as case studies. This will be Elands Bay and Deep Kloof, which is on the west coast of South Africa. Blombos, which is here on the south coast, and then Sibutu here on the Indian Ocean coast in KwaZulu-Natal. So the general kind of research questions that we have approaching these sites is one of site formation, right? So how did these deposits form? And what role did humans play, if any, in the accumulation of these deposits? But in order to do that, we kind of also have to answer, well, how do we deal with such complex sequences? And how then can we kind of unravel or kind of read something about what humans were doing there, if these are anthropogenic deposits, which they are, by the way. But we also want to understand what are the post-depositional processes of alteration. Okay, what is the history of these deposits after they've accumulated? And ultimately, then we want to use these anthropogenic deposits to interpret how people lived in the past, right? To treat them as kind of artifacts that can tell us about something that people were doing on these sites. So how do we study these deposits? I think you could probably guess that we use micromorphology to do this. But even using just micromorphology and thin section analysis is really not enough on its own. Here you can see a micro XRF scan of one of these micromorphology blocks that we've collected, and you can see that they're even under magnification, or this is not magnification, but even in block form, they're incredibly complex deposits. They have many different sedimentary components, and they have millimeter scale depositional units. So even within a 10 or 15 centimeter block, you can have up to 60 discrete depositional units within the sequence. So there's an incredible wealth of data and information contained within these blocks, but we need to figure out a way to deal with all of that data. And the 2 approaches that we've been using here are what has been called a microcontextual approach, and we've heard this term used in some of the other talks, and then also applying the concept of microfacies. So let's take a look at what we mean by a microcontextual approach. Francesco Berna, who's here and talking tomorrow, was one of the leading people to develop this approach. But when we take a thin section, and particularly for sites like this, we're doing micromorphology, but what we're really doing is microstratigraphy, right? These thin sections are basically like profiles of an archaeological site. And we're describing them just like you would describe a profile in the field, except we're doing it under the microscope, right? Now, the microcontextual approach kind of takes that a little bit further and says, okay, we aren't just going to describe the profiles, but we're going to kind of excavate the individual layers in thin section, meaning that we treat each of these kind of components that we find in the microstratigraphic unit as an artifact in and of itself that we can analyze individually using different techniques. Okay, so it really kind of expands that concept of looking at a profile and excavation down to the microscopic scale, which is what we need to do with these types of deposits. So just give you an example, this comes from Susan's work at Classy's River. Here we're looking at, you have a scale right here. This is a single combustion feature, okay? So here we see we have a thin ash layer. Well, there's a very thin charcoal layer here, and this is on top of a sandy deposit with a broken shell. So looking at this, we might have questions, well, how well is the ash preserved? What is the relationship of the different components, the bone, the shell, etc.? What's the composition of this organic material? Is it charred? Okay, these are all kind of the research questions that develop out of this. As an example of how we can approach that using a microcontextual analysis here, we have a zoomed in image of this ash lens. And in each of these stars here, what we've done is we've collected a spectra using, I feel sorry for the translators, using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, micro FTIR, okay? And here we're able to obtain spectra that can give us information about the temperature at which the bone was heated, okay? So here within the ash lens, we see this bone fragment here. It's white, it looks calcined. We can confirm that then here with this FTIR spectra. The bone above it, okay, in a different context, is not heated to that temperature. It's lower than 550. Here below it is the same, okay? So we're obtaining information about the temperature of heating of these bones within these individual contexts. There's a whole host of different types of techniques that can supplement micromorphological analysis, and it begins already in the field, okay? It extends to analyses that can be conducted on the blocks, loose analyses, but then these microcontextual analyses where we can also obtain information using micro FTIR, micro XRD, micro XRF, et cetera, directly on the indurated block or the thin section itself. So the other approach that we use is what we call a microfacies analysis. And this is something that's been borrowed from carbonate petrology and other sedimentary petrographic approaches. And it was initially applied to archaeology by Marie-Agnes Corti. Jimena Villagran is a big proponent of this and a significant voice in the development of this approach. But basically, when you look at these types of sites, there are thousands of individual discrete depositional episodes. And if you wanted to describe each one, you would end up writing a book of descriptions, right? So how do you actually deal with this? And so what you start to realize when you look at them is, well, some of these layers look like the other, okay? Things start to resemble each other. And so what a microfacies analysis does is it categorizes and classifies the individual depositional units into a kind of system of saying, okay, there's an ashy microfacies, there's a charcoal microfacies. So just to kind of give you an example, we can return back to this Classy's picture. So we saw that we have this ash lens here, okay? But if we look at this in terms of the microstratigraphy, we have here at the base this lens of sand and broken up shell, a very thin charcoal lens, and then this ash lens. And then it repeats. Sand and shell, thin charcoal, ash. So we have 6 depositional units, but 3 microfacies. The sand and shell, the charcoal, and the ash. Now, what's important here is that we see that they repeat, okay? But there's a stratigraphic association, right? Sandy shell, charcoal, ash. Sandy shell, charcoal, ash, okay? And it's those associations that can then allow us to make interpretations, saying, okay, when we find this sequence, we associate it with a hearth. And so this is what we've been doing at these sites. Here, this is an example from Deep Kloof. So here, for example, we have charcoal with ash, charcoal with ash. This association we interpret as a hearth. We can say they built a hearth here, and then they built another hearth on top of that. Okay, so microfacies is kind of a type of middle range theory, right? That allows us to take these observations and transform them into interpretations about what people were doing in the past. Okay, so we'll talk about microfacies a little bit later, but I want to step back and look at how we use microcontextual analyses to study chemical diagenesis. And the case study we'll use is from Eland's Bay Cave. Eland's Bay Cave is located right here in this rocky promontory on the Atlantic coast of South Africa. This is called Baboon Point because it looks kind of like a baboon in profile. So it's located right here, right on the coastline in Eland's Bay. It's on the modern day coast. Further inland, you have the site of Deep Kloof, which we'll also talk about today. Despite the name, it's not a cave, it's a rock shelter. It's formed within the Table Mountain group sandstones, within some jointing plains. And the site was originally excavated in the 1970s by John Parkington. He cleared out most of the later Stone Age deposits, but left the middle Stone Age deposits behind. And we revisited the site in 2013-14 to look at the middle Stone Age deposits. And when we opened up the old trenches, we found this. And Susan wanted her picture taken with it because she's a bigger fan of diagenesis than I am. And what we saw were the profiles were covered with these nodules. Now, these were documented in the 1970s as well. We also found crotavinas that were coated in gypsum that formed around the edge. And even these white these gypsum nodules here kind of destroying and breaking up blocks of sandstone within the deposit. Okay, so diagenesis is playing a really big story here in the Middle Stone Age. Here's the main profile that we were working from. Here at the base, we have a very early Middle Stone Age. It's not well dated, but probably dates sometime to MAS 5. And then we have a major unconformity right here. And then we begin a sequence that goes from about 40,000 years ago, kind of end of the Middle Stone Age, up into early, later Stone Age. Now, what they noticed during excavation is that in this part of the excavation, they didn't find any bones, but you had actually very nice preservation of the microstratigraphy. Over here, they did find bone, but it was destroyed by the growth of these nodules. So our question was kind of very simple. What's going on here? If any of you are familiar with the Middle Paleolithic of Israel, the question of where did the bones go is a classic one from geoarchaeology. But to answer this at Eland's Bay, we have to step back a little bit. And what you notice is that here in the sandstone, you have this joint within the bedrock, and along it, you have a groundwater seep. And if you look in more closely, you see that you get secondary minerals forming, evaporative minerals forming on the edge of this joint, mostly gypsum here. And that actually extends down into this cone of diagenesis that's occurring within here. So we think that this is kind of the cause of these chemical transformations, that we have groundwater seepage into the deposit. So we were lucky enough that it rained while we were there, so we could collect a sample of the water that's coming through the seep. And you see the elements that it's enriched in relative to the rainwater that doesn't seep through piles of hyrax feces before it enters into the site. So we have enrichment in calcium and iron, potassium, which plays an important role, phosphorus, of course, as well. So let's zoom in to the micromorphology. So here we're at that unconformity that I pointed out. You can see it actually here. Below the unconformity, we have a lot of soil aggregates, clay with quartz, silt, and sand, but they don't look very happy, do they? So here you can see that there's something actually growing within them. We have transformation of the clays occurring here. And using micro XRF, we can see what it's enriched in, aluminum, but also phosphorus. Confirming this then with micro FTIR and actually micro XRD, we were able to confirm that it's a mineral variscite, okay, so an aluminum phosphate. Okay, so we have here very acidic conditions enriched in phosphorus coming from the seep, altering the clay minerals, forming variscite. If we move up sequence here, we see that we have these kind of yellowish coatings and veins throughout the deposit. Let's zoom in here onto this sandstone rock fragment with the yellow coating. Here you can see it right here. This is tyrannicite. Okay, so I think some of you are familiar with tyrannicite. What's really interesting is that we see within the tyrannicite pseudomorphic voids after gypsum. Okay, so this tells us that we have kind of a sequence of minerals that have formed here. So we have gypsum initially forming, then tyrannicite, then dissolution of the gypsum. Okay, so this suggests a change in moisture regime, going from slightly drier into wetter, and also more acidic. Okay, so we confirmed that this is tyrannicite, and actually with micro-XRF, it seems like it's more within the potassium end member of tyrannicite. Tyrannicite, as you probably know, forms under low pH conditions. Okay, it's a low pH phosphate mineral, and what you get is a hydroxyapatite coming from the bone, but also other places is not stable. And you can actually see in micromorphology pieces of bone that are getting eaten and transformed into tyrannicite. So that's where the bones went at Elandsby. Moving outwards into this part of the site, we see we have lots of nodules, okay? And we have bone. However, the growth of the nodules fragments the bone into little tiny pieces, okay? Most of these nodules are composed of gypsum. The yellowish ones are hydroxyl apatite. Okay? There are a few other kind of unusual phases here. Ardeolite and whitlockite are also forming. Okay? But what we're seeing here with the secondary formation of hydroxyl apatite is we actually have higher pH conditions. Okay? So putting this all together, we have a zone of tyrannicite over here with variscite limited to the area below the unconformity. And over in this area, we have gypsum and apatite with a few other kind of more unusual phases. So basically what we're seeing is that we have a gradient from the seep where we have a decrease in moisture, okay? So we're getting more soluble minerals like gypsum present, and we have an increase in pH, so that it's more acidic over here where the seepage is, and we have more alkaline, or at least neutral conditions over here. A big question with all diagenesis is, when did this happen? And that's really hard to answer. We talked about that over breakfast with uranium thorium dating of gypsum. Okay, so we could do that here. But there are some kind of micromorphological, microstratigraphic tricks that we could use, and microcontextual as well. So first of all, we see that variscite formation is limited to below the unconformity. So we think, even though we do have clay aggregates higher up, so we think that we're looking at two different phases of diagenesis, which would suggest that variscite formation is something that happened relatively early in the sequence. What was very interesting is that some of these apatite nodules that we found, we measured with micro FTIR, and we found one that had a high temperature phosphate peak, meaning that it had been heated. So this means that it formed and then was heated, probably by a fire that was lit at the site. And charcoal dates from that layer give us an age of about 19,000. So that suggests that that nodule had formed prior to 19,000 years ago. So to us, that suggested that the seep water and diagenesis was something that was occurring throughout the sedimentary buildup of the site, that it was contemporaneous with sedimentation. And this became very important when we started looking at the luminescence ages, because this told us then that the radiation that's coming from the potassium in these secondary minerals was basically present since deposition, okay, since the last exposure to the grain. And so it's not something that happened much later that could actually affect your calculations of the beta radiation. And it turned out then when we compared radiocarbon with luminescence ages that they actually matched quite nicely. Okay, so let's move on now to some other sites and look not at minerals and diagenesis so much, but look at these anthropogenic deposits. And the two sites I want to look at are kind of the two classic ones that we worked on initially, the site of Sibutu and the site of Diepkloof. They're very far apart from each other. As you can see, Diepkloof is over here in the Western Cape. Sibutu here is over in KwaZulu-Natal. They're about or more than 1,000 kilometers apart from each other. But they both have similar cultural sequences. Okay, they both have a Howison port. They both have a still bay. They're one of only a handful of sites that actually have these two techno-complexes in the same stratigraphic sequence. They're both sandstone shelters. They're both close to the coast, but not coastal. They're both about 17 kilometers inland. But they do have very different ecological settings. Sibutu is a subtropical Afro-montane woodland, and Deep Kloof is a semi-arid Mediterranean sandveld. So let's start at Sibutu. Here's a photogrammetric reconstruction of the site against the wall of the shelter, and here's the excavation trench. This is Susan's on-site FTIR laboratory. This tent, she sits in there with her little portable FTIR, collecting spectra all day. And here we can see the stratigraphic sequence. So here, the large part of the sequence is attributed to a broad kind of post-Howison port, post-dating 60,000 years ago. Then we have the Howison port and Still Bay, and then the pre-Still Bay. Now, what you can notice here already is that there's a major kind of stratigraphic break here in the sequence. So above post-dating around 58,000, post-dating 60,000, we have these very finely laminated deposits, and below that it looks a little bit more homogeneous. So let's take a closer look. Here's that break, okay? So you see the 60,000 year deposits are these very complex lenses of white and black material. Below that, we still have these white and black lenses, but they're kind of floating within this homogeneous material. So when we look at this homogeneous material lower down, what we see is that it's composed of sand, but there's also a lot of organic matter. There's a lot of bone fragments that are burnt, that are sand sized. There's a lot of charcoal. Okay, so it's really anthropogenic, and it's a lot of burnt stuff, but it's not in a fireplace. Okay, it's been disturbed. And we interpret this as material that's been trampled, right? Sandy surface that people have been walking on and churning this material over time. Lower down, we also have intact haars. You see here we have a nice red, black, white sequence with ashes on top. Note the scale here. It's only a few millimeters thick, okay? Single hearth, just one single burning event. When we look above 60,000 in this very complex layer, we find a lot of burnt material, but it's not generally found within these haars. We find ashes, charcoal, burnt bone, all kind of jumbled together. And to us, this looks like material that was burnt and then probably collected and dumped or swept or raked out of a hearth. And in these upper 60,000 year layers, we find these very striking layers that are, in some cases, quite laterally extensive, anywhere from a few millimeters to a few centimeters thick, that at the base are composed of this laminated fibrous charcoal or herbaceous charcoal that grades into laminated and articulated phytoliths. And this is what we interpret at the site as plant bedding, sedges that were brought to the site to construct a floor. But we have evidence here in terms of the charcoal that these were actually burnt, so that they constructed a floor, used it, and then, as part of maintenance of the site, lit it on fire. So all of these little lenses here reflect little actions that people did. This is exactly what Carolina was talking about in the first talk, these little moments of time, right? We can see someone lit a hearth here, you know, or we can see that someone threw some sedges on the floor to make a nice place to live, okay? But these are also contained within a stratigraphic sequence, right? And so we can define each microfacies or association and assign it a kind of an action and look at how these actions occur within the stratigraphic sequence. Now, this doesn't mean that, you know, people came to the site, they put down some bedding, they lit it on fire, they left, they came and had a hearth and swept it out. We can use another concept from facies, Walter's law, right, to think about what this vertical sequence means, right? So here we're looking at a vertical sequence of facies, of actions, but really what we're looking at is the lateral variation of actions that occur within a single occupation. And then as occupations repeat over time, these laterally adjacent facies overlap within the stratigraphic sequence. But if we step out further then and look at these microfacies and how they occur within the stratigraphic sequence, we can start to explain why we have this big stratigraphic break here at Cebudu. So here, prior to 60,000 years ago, we have people living on bare dirt surfaces for the most part, trampling the sand, okay, mixing all this stuff up. Occasionally we get a hearth, they light it. It's a single-use hearth generally. They abandon it, and that's it. Okay, so it's a very kind of low-intensity occupation. There's not so much maintenance of the site. After 60,000 years ago, so post 60,000 years ago, we have a big change in how they're living at the site. We don't find so many hearths, but we find lots of burnt material. That means they're cleaning up and dumping, managing this waste developed within the hearth. And they're laying down plant material on the surfaces, constructing a domestic space that they then also in turn maintain by lighting it on fire. Okay, so there's a very big change in how occupation is occurring here at Cebudu, and it's recorded within these deposits. Now, just kind of quickly moving on to Deep Kloof, you can see the site of Deep Kloof here. It's in a rock shelter in this copy right here. It's a very similar sequence to Cebudu. Again, slightly thinner post house and support, a much thicker house and support, and still bay below that. At Deep Kloof, we see a similar type of pattern. So here we have this break. Above it, this is within the house and support, okay? We have these finely laminated black-white layers. And below that, we have isolated individual hearths floating within this trample. So we think at Deep Kloof, we generally have a very kind of similar type of occupation recorded within the deposits. That we have these intact hearths with bare floors. Here, we don't find any combustion features, so we think they may have been living actually somewhere else within the shelter. But then, again, here we have hearths. We get basin hearths, so hearths that are probably being used more intensively. We get ash dumps. We even get some evidence for burnt bedding here as well. Okay. So both at Cebudu and Deep Kloof, we see this pattern of shifting from low-intensity occupation to high-intensity occupation recorded within the deposits. So here's just kind of comparing this between the two. The timing when that occurs is not necessarily contemporaneous. Okay, we see this occurring within the house and support at Deep Kloof, and here occurring after the house and support at Cebudu, but it's generally a similar pattern. Now, one of the problems with this study is that we looked at it completely vertically, right? We had a telephone booth and we collected a column sample. And we're talking about spatial use of a site, right? So we can use a little bit of geological theory trickery with Walter's law to say some stuff about this, but at the end of the day, we don't actually know what they were doing over in that corner where we didn't excavate, right? So the site of Blombos allowed us to apply these concepts to a site where we had much greater lateral extent. So here we see the site of Blombos. It's in a different part of South Africa. It's on the south coast. And it is actually today a coastal site, okay? So here you can see the ocean. This is the Table Mountain sandstone that we talked about before. Here it's much more metamorphosed. On top of that, we have these calcarenites. And at the contact between the Table Mountain sandstone and these calcarenites, we have the formation of caves here, including Blombos Cave, you see right here. So it's a much smaller site than Deep Kloof or Cebudu, which means that we were able to excavate it over a much larger area. So here you can see a photogrammetric reconstruction of the site and several of the different profiles that we have sampled. So we have a transect here from the front to the back of the cave, and then also another transect going this way. And many of the samples were collected beginning in 2000. So we have samples beginning from here going in that direction. So we have really good lateral coverage at the site. Now, before we talk about that, I want to bring in some more microcontextual analyses. One of my favorite microcontextual studies that Magnus did, which focused on the mineral glauconite. Okay, within the calcarenite bedrock at Deep Kloof, we have lots of glauconite grains. Okay. And these fall down and get mixed into the sandy deposits at Plumbos. Now, glauconite, we generally know as this kind of green mineral. If it weathers, it goes kind of orangish brown, right? But if you heat glauconite, it changes color in a very predictable way, which you can see here going from green, okay? Here's an example of kind of low temperature heating, still green, but once we get up to around 300, 400, it turns to orange. Above around 600, we get red, and then it becomes kind of black. And we can also trace this then using micro FTIR, okay, with very distinctive changes in the peaks that we can track. So these glauconite grains are kind of distributed evenly within the deposits. And so they kind of act like little paleothermometers, telling us what temperature they've been heated. So what we could do is actually use here the micro FTIR and then the colorimetry of the grains to interpolate heating temperature. So what you see here then is actually a heat map from a hearth, and here a basin hearth. So here with the black and the red, we have higher temperature heating, 700, 800 degrees. Below that, we can see lower temperature heating and then unheated grains. Okay. So this creates one additional layer of information that we can add to our interpretation. So let's take a look here. So we have our kind of standard micromorphology, okay, and we can do our microstratigraphic interpretation. So we have here kind of this fibrous organic matter. There's some phosphate-rich material coming from biogenic sources. But then here we have an intact ash feature, some type of hearth, and you can see that in the heat interpolation map. So you see here, it's all of these grains are heated consistently within that micro context. So that tells us that it's an intact feature. That's different than the microstratigraphic units above or below, where we have a few heated grains adjacent to non-heated glauconite grains. That tells us that these have been mixed somehow, probably through trampling. We can assign these in microfacies, okay, and then offer some interpretations so that we have some charred plant material, an undisturbed hearth feature, and then a shellfish matrix deposit. I won't call it a midden in Jimena's honor. So we can do this at the individual sample level, okay, but then we can also do this across occupation levels. And we can also do this diachronically at the site. Okay, so this allowed Magnus then to really look at how the site was used during specific time slices. So here, I think this is M2, so around 80,000 years ago or so. What we found is a lot of trampling here in the center part of the site. And then on the flanks of the site, we have middens, ash middens, shell middens, intact hearths, okay? So we can see parts of the site where people were living, parts of the site where people were dumping their waste. So we have structuring of waste disposal within the site at this time. Now, this is something that we don't observe later on within the sequence. And in fact, if you look at the lowest part of the occupation, this is where we see the most intensive use of the site, the most intensive maintenance of the site and structuring of the waste. As we move higher up, here going from around 90,000, here it stops at around 70,000. At this point, we see kind of thin individual hearths, trampled surfaces, but not so much site maintenance. And Magnus interpreted this as reflecting kind of a shift in occupational intensity. So kind of the opposite of what we saw at Diepkloof and Sibudu. Okay. And he framed this within a Binfordian paradigm, suggesting that we're going from shifting from residential occupation or residential mobility to logistical mobility. The question is, why do we see these shifts in occupation? You know, we never offered a reason at Sibudu or Diepkloof, and I still don't feel like offering a reason for it there. But at Plumbos, we think we might actually be able to tie this to what's going on in the broader environment. Okay, so during the earliest phases of occupation at Plumbos, okay, so around 95,000 years ago, the coastline is basically where it is today. There's a very rich resource base almost adjacent to the site in terms of all the shellfish that are available there. And so that's when we see intensive residential use of Plumbos. as we move further in time, 70,000 years ago, okay, and then 72,000 years ago, the sea level changes and the coastline moves further away, as do the coastal resources. And that's then when we see a shift away from intensive use of blombos to more short-term logistical use of the site. So we think that the occupational change here is relating to changes in coastline. So with that, I think I'll wrap up with the case studies, but I'd like to point out that I think that the deposits here that we find in South Africa from these Middle Stone Age rock shelters are really kind of a perfect laboratory for developing new methods that we can apply at many different sites. And we've been doing this now in Brazil, but also in many other locations, but also for developing kind of theoretical approaches to dealing with anthropogenic deposits. And I think that this also really clearly demonstrates that anthropogenic deposits are really artifacts in their own right, okay, that contain information about past behavior and that should be considered when we are interpreting archaeological sites. So with that, I'll say thank you, danke, obrigado.
Very much, Chris, for the excellent talk. Anybody has questions, comments? Elizabeth?
Thanks a lot. This was extreme. I enjoyed. What about the climate changes during this time? How this affected the people who lived there?
Yes, I mean, you see, it's a big question for the Middle Stone Age. You see drying trends around 70,000 years ago as well. And there's some idea that that might be affecting more interior occupation, but here along the coastline, I think that the bigger player, let's say, is the position of the coastline. Yeah, but there have been people that have argued that aridification is impacting this. Yeah.
Thank you. Very inspiring, Christopher. A lot of questions, but I wonder, with the last diapositive slide,
Yeah.
sorry, what about the experience you have with the dialogue with the archaeologists? For example, does this using sediment as an artifact?
Yeah.
Do you have some challenge of narrative proposed by the other archaeologists? For example, how does it cross with lithics and archaeofaunal interpretation? Does you have some case where you were proposing other interpretation
Yes, yeah.
compared to what they propose?
Yeah. So for the Blumbo story with changes in occupational intensity, that was published together with a taphonomic study of faunal remains, looking at trampling marks, and they generally tend to fit together, actually. So we've when we do these types of interpretations, if we have other lines of evidence that can be used, usually for kind of faunal taphonomic studies, we do try to integrate them. We've been working with Jerome Reynard from Wits University, but yeah, the publication where this was in, we incorporated the faunal data, and it seems to fit. So we were pleased about that. The lithics, not so much, but yeah. I mean, they don't necessarily tell us too much about the occupational intensity, or they haven't been studied in that way so far, let's say.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great research.
Thank you.
Great place.
Yes, beautiful. Yeah.
Nice environment.
Yeah.
First question is continuation of the question of Elizabeth. You really showed us the section with certain shifts in occupation, but also crossing great climate changes, transitions, if we compare it with the global climate records. Your section passed through late substages of stage 5, stage 5, then 4, something quite quite harsh environment. Then entering into 3,
Mhm.
and you talk, and now the question is, maybe these are all affected or not the human occupation, but do you see any evidences in the profiles? You tell us about
Mhm.
human-induced features, but
Mhm.
is there some reaction of the profiles to these climatic changes in their micromorphological properties, weathering intensity, formation of minerals, something?
No. There's a lot of environmental information coming from that you can get from the botanical and faunal stuff. In terms of the sediments themselves, at least at Sibutu and Deep Kloof, I would say no. The major geogenic process of accumulation is granular disintegration of the sandy bedrock and spall formation. And that seems to be a generally more continuous process. At Eland's Bay, this spall-rich layer at the base was originally interpreted in the 70s by Carl Butzer as indicating colder conditions. I disagree with that because you don't actually get frost. He was using frost formation of spall. The main process of spall formation at these sites is actually salt-induced spalling. So there's kind of, at least at those two sites, you have kind of a general background of sand accumulation, and then overprinting that is biogenic and anthropogenic signatures. Now, that's not true for all sites. If you look at the South Coast sites, Classes, Blumbos, Clipdrift, the main source of geogenic sedimentation is not just the spallation, but it's also coastal sand. And you get phases of significant input of sand building up. So if you look at Blumbos, for example, or I don't know if, we closed it, but okay, so the sequence goes from about 90,000 to 70,000, and then you get the sand layer. There it is, okay. Here we go, okay. So this right here, this dates to 70,000 years ago. It's a dune sand. The site was completely covered by sand dunes, and it only opens up again, okay, during the very later Stone Age, Iron Age, okay, when you actually get like, signatures of the Bantu expansion with sheep coming in there, okay. So the site is closed off. So there are major environmental things. Broadly climatic related to sea level change. There are climatic changes as well, mostly related to aridification here. Okay, but I think what's affecting the occupation of these sites is actually more the landscape dynamics, which is governed by coastal processes, but also local processes. Other sites are not getting closed off by dunes at 70,000 years ago. You go further along the coastline, you have occupation at Clipdrift Shelter that post-dates this to 65 to 60. However, by 60,000 years ago, you get dune build up there as well. Okay, so it's a global process along the coast, but it's also kind of locally generated. If you look at the Middle Stone Age much more broadly, yes, and people have argued that the reason that you don't actually have many, if at any all, transition sites between the MSA and the LSA is because you're actually in the last glacial maximum. It's very arid. You don't find a lot of sites. So on a very kind of global story of the MSA, yes, maybe even on like more local stories, but I don't, it's not, for me, this is not recording climate. In terms of the geogenic processes, it's recording landscape and environment. If that makes sense. And humans, of course, yes. Yeah.
And if I am allowed one more question. Thank you, Jimena. And the second question refers to diagenesis. If I understand right, you are in favor of a sort of sedimentary or diagenesis means occurring in the same time or shortly after the deposition of layers. Well, this sedimentary diagenesis, I would call sedimentary pedogenesis better, because we are on the surface, right? Well, this is terminology.
The
This
terminology
is
is
not the
it.
question.
Yeah.
Terminology
Yeah.
is a matter of personal bias.
Yeah.
But the question is, even such soluble and dynamic minerals as gypsum do not move, do not dissolve, do not rearrange after deposition and keep the signal of sedimentary geogenesis?
For the very soluble stuff, I don't know actually, but that seems to be the case. But we saw, for example, that we do have evidence for dissolution of gypsum earlier on. For example, with the pseudomorphic voids that we're seeing in the Tyrannicite, right? So it's not that it can't change, but not all these minerals are the same. So the gypsum is very soluble, and so I imagine that you can get recrystallization over time and everything. Things like Tyrannicite, okay, are not very soluble, right? So once you form those, then they're generally going to be pretty stable. And Francesco, who knows a lot more about this than I do, has his hand up actually.
You want to jump into the discussion?
So I don't know if I agree about pedogenesis inside a cave, but this is one thing. But to answer this question, I think what you may have there is you go from gypsum to ardilite, which is a sulfate phosphate, and then to taranakite. So those are, I think, Ruti described them in some fresh deposits of, so makes total sense that it's in the positional. I had another question because I never noticed that, but thank you for a fantastic presentation. And a little bit gets to what Luca was saying. So when you look at the use of the sites during the steel bay and the always zone, whatever you say, port, you see a less occupation density, right? Is that what?
I wouldn't
Okay.
tie them to the individual techno complexes because it's variable from site to site.
Okay, but so there's no. My question was, you had different fire intensity, and it's just because they were there less, or because also they didn't know how to use fire in the steel bay as in the always. It's just
No, I get what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, what we're looking at, everything that we're looking at here are HARS and fire, right? It's more to do with kind of the nature of the fire residues and the actions of burning, and then also what happens to them after burning. So, in some of these sites we get very thin. I showed you the example from Zebudu. It's a millimeter thick. That's a single burn event, and then they didn't do anything after it went out. So they burnt something and left it. And that's a very different type of combustion feature than a basin hearth that's filled with ash. That implies that in the same location, they're feeding it with fuel, that they're maintaining it, okay? Or like at Deep Kloof, where we'll see a hearth, charcoal ash, and then directly on top of it, charcoal ash. All of those imply different ways of kind of dealing with a fire. Or if you have an ash dump, right? Because it implies that they're cleaning that out. And that cleaning is what we're calling site maintenance activities. And we're interpreting that, and that fits in line with also some of the like ethnographic work that like John Yellen or Bob Kelly have looked at, where when you're maintaining a site, it implies that you're living there for a longer period of time. Right? And if you're structuring your secondary waste, that implies that it's a longer term occupation. And so that's kind of where we're coming from with that. No. And to be honest, I mean, the Still Bay, we have 3 Still Bay sites that we've sampled. Deep Kloof, Zebudu, Blombos. Blombos looks totally different than the other 2, I mean, where we do see kind of a pattern that ties with the techno complexes is the Howisson's-Port. So Howisson's-Port, post Howisson's-Port, that like 65 to 60, going maybe even to 55, that's when we see these really laminated packets of deposit, and that's really consistent. across South Africa. They might begin slightly differently. They definitely end slightly differently, but that's kind of this pattern. And the Howson-Sport is the technocomplex that looks very, very similar across the entire subcontinent. The Howson-Sport is when you get those back bladelets everywhere. It's when you find engraved ostrich shell in Namibia and the south coast of South Africa, right? So it is a characteristic, but I think it's probably more of a cultural thing. But, on the south coast, it ends very clearly at 60. Deep Kloof, it keeps on going into the post-Howson-Sport. Sibutu, it only really begins in the post-Howson-Sport around 60,000 years ago, But kind of looking at it very broadly, there is that. So, but I don't want to say it's a difference between the Stilbe and the Howson-Sport. Yeah.
Questions? Somebody else? Julia.
Bom, primeiro, parabéns pela apresentação. Achei fantástico.
Thank you. I got that. Thank you.
Eu tenho uma questão com a utilização da glauconita. É um hidrossilicato, um filosilicato, de potássio e ferro. E ele é altigênico, uma coisa assim. E ela sofre um intemperismo muito rápido. Rapidamente ela se intemperiza, E o fato dela se intemperizar com muita rapidez não altera, às vezes, a interpretação do contexto que está estudando quando leva ela como referência?
Acho que eu lembro. So he's asking about the glauconite.
Yes.
That it's a very unstable mineral. So he's wondering if all the changes that you see in the glauconite could not be related to weathering instead of heating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we studied the FTR signature is very different for the weathered grains. The color is very different as well, based on experimentation. And yeah, we're pretty convinced that this is a result of heating that we're seeing. We do see weathered glauconite grains in the deposit, but we can pick them out quite distinctly in terms of their appearance, but also in terms of their spectra. Yeah.
Okay. So if more questions, I just wanted to make a comment. I think it's very interesting, linked to what Luca asked and Francesco and also Sergey and Elizabeth, this thing about like climate and human behavior, because you were showing this very sharp contrast, like for, I think it was Deep Kloof and Sibutu, right? So you have the low intensity occupation with the sporadic hearth, and then they're packing up, they're building a lot of fire and occupying a lot. But you show that the chronology doesn't necessarily match of when these things happen. There's this relationship with the techno-complexes, but it's also not that direct. And then Blombos, that's down the coast. It's another scenario. So what I think is interesting is that it seems like for Blombos, the influence of sea level changes. It's very obvious. So you can actually relate it to, let's say, environmental changes or climate. Now for the sites more to the inland, it doesn't really... It's not that straightforward, right?
No, it's not. I mean, I've talked about this with Curtis Marion, and he is a very big proponent of climate and environment impacting this. And he says, yeah, I mean, look, it's getting dry. I forget what he was arguing. It's like, oh, it's getting drier and you're seeing this, so therefore that's what it is. And I don't want to rule it out, but I'm a little bit hesitant. The dating is really problematic here. They're using luminescence, and you have huge errors and disagree. There are two completely different chronologies for Deep Kloof as well. So it's really hard to correlate across the sites. But even if you're just using these like techno cultures or the techno complexes, it's very different. But
so it's more about, it's like you were saying, local.
It is,
phenomena. Like somehow related with the micro prehistory that Carolina was saying.
Yeah.
Each site tells its own story. Right?
It does. Yeah.
Well, Lucy. And then we go to the coffee break.
Just possibly a stupid question provoked by being a Northern Hemisphere person.
Okay.
What about seasonality? Any chance they're using the site at different times of year in different layers?
That is definitely a possibility. Trying to think of studies where they've looked at. I know that they are working on it using the marine shell to look at that. But I don't know any. I don't know. Francesco, do you know any seasonality studies from South Africa they've talked, at least from these sites. Yeah, they do. They're working on, sclerochronology, but yeah. Yes, I remember that discussion. Yeah. But I mean, there's definitely a rhythm to this, as in any hunter-gatherer society, where it's being driven by, when you're harvesting shellfish and all of that. But that's not necessarily tied directly to the seasons, and the seasons are a bit different there than as well. But people are looking at it with the sclerochronology, so looking at the shell sections.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, again for the talk. So now for the coffee break, we will switch locations a bit just to make use of the building. So we're going upstairs on the 4th floor to the outside. There's like this roofed area in like a balcony, and there will be the coffee break. Então o coffee break vai ser no 4º andar, o elevador fica aqui à direita, mas tem escada também, numa área externa. Então vocês saem do elevador, vão direito, saem do prédio.